increasingly are lining up behind the single-payer health care bill set to be introduced by Senator Bernie Sanders today, but party leadership not among them. Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi both declined to endorse that bill. Schumer says he's currently looking at all the health care bills proposed by Democrats, while Congresswoman Pelosi says she's focused on protecting Obamacare. Pelosi also denies the issue has become a litmus test for Democrats ahead of the 2020 presidential nomination, despite potential contenders racing to support the so-called Medicare for All proposal. Co-sponsors will include Senators Elizabeth Warren, Cory Booker, Kamala Harris, Kirsten Gillibrand, and Jeff Merkley, all among the president's fiercest opponents. Joining us now, member of the Foreign Relations, Appropriations, and Health Committees, Democratic Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut. Senator Murphy is working on a bill being described as a bridge to single-payer health care. Senator, good morning. So what does that mean, a bridge to single-payer health care? Are you for single-payer or against it?
So I've always said that if I was to design the American healthcare system from scratch, I'd design a single-payer system. It makes absolutely no sense logically to tie people's health insurance to their employer. And I think we're having a really important conversation about how we get there. Senator Sanders is going to introduce a bill today that I'll take a hard look at. And I've introduced a different concept, which is to allow every American to be able to buy into Medicare and essentially allow consumers to decide whether they want private insurance or Medicare. My belief is that given that choice, consumers would choose Medicare, and it would allow for almost a more natural transition into a single-payer system. I think this is a really important moment where the Democrats can talk about what we want the American healthcare system to look like 10 years from now, but it should not distract from the fact that Republicans are still intent on trying to, at least over the next few weeks, pass a repeal of the Affordable Care Act. And I would argue that 90%, 95% of our attention still needs to be on stopping that effort.
So, Senator, you want to get to single payer eventually, is what you're saying. You just believe there are a few steps in the road before we get there.
And Senator Brian Schatz of Hawaii has an interesting proposal to allow individuals to buy into Medicaid. Yes, no, absolutely. I think many Democrats are operating under the same aspirational premise. It's just a matter of how we get there. And I hope that a lot of Democrats and progressives will take a look at all of the proposals that are out there.
Jonathan.
Senator Jonathan Lemire with the Associated Press. Wanted to ask you about the president's latest efforts at sort of bipartisanship. His deal last week, of course, with Senator Schumer and Minority Leader Pelosi, the dinner last night with some senators, Democratic senators from states that the president won. Do you feel like right now the Democratic Party should be making deals with the president? Do you think that what issues do you feel like you guys could theoretically work together with him, or do you feel like this is something we need to just stay opposed to largely what's coming out of the White House?
Well, I think we should be open to talking to the president in order to keep the government up and operating, in order to raise the debt ceiling, in order to protect the dreamers. You're going to have to be talking to, if not the president, Republicans. So we should be open to that conversation. Listen, the fact of the matter is the governing majority in the United States Congress still remains the majority of the Democratic caucus and the minority of the Republican caucus. So in order to get anything done here, you are going to have to bring the two parties together. This dinner last night on tax reform, I'm glad he's talking to Democrats, but nobody has any clue what the president or Republicans means by tax reform. So this is all a very theoretical conversation about whether we could find any common ground on an issue that the Republicans have yet to define.
Steve Ratner, the common ground we found obviously has to do with the debt. And when I hear people talking about Medicare for all, like Bernie Sanders and the Democrats talking about Medicare for all, you look at the number, just look at the demographics. People over 65 years old will grow by 75% in the next 2 decades. In the next decade, Medicare outlays will not be covered by 50% of the money that's going into Medicare. That means the other 50%, let's face it, we're not going to raise taxes. So it's not like that's going to be paid for. That's just piled straight onto the debt. And that's for the existing Medicare program. I'll say about this Medicare for All plan what I said about George Bush's Medicare Part D plan. Unless you're going to pay for it, don't talk about it. We're already facing $50 trillion of unfunded mandates over the next 3-4 decades. Would you agree with that, Steve?
Well, as someone who just reached Medicare age 2 months ago, I completely agree with that. I'm very sensitive to this problem and aware of it. But yes, it is a problem, Senator. And I think that I think part of why there seems to be hesitation on the part of the Senate leadership to back such a proposal is because there is no obvious way of paying for it. There's no proposal to pay for it that I'm aware of. And it's basically setting up a kind of litmus test within the Democratic Party as to whether they're going to be fiscally responsible, as Joe was alluding to, and find ways to pay for these entitlements, or whether we Democrats are going to continue to simply layer more programs on top of more programs that aren't paid for.
Well, A, it should not be a litmus test for Democrats, but B, we need to step back and figure out how you attack a healthcare system that costs twice as much as every other country, many of which have single-payer healthcare systems, for results that are middling. The Affordable Care Act, yes, it was expensive in terms of government outlays, but it did result in the overall amount of healthcare inflation in this country reaching record lows. So you shouldn't think that just because there's an additional government expense, that necessarily inflates the overall cost of health care to individuals. You've got to look at the full amount of money that individuals are paying, either through premiums, deductibles, co-pays, or taxes, and come up with a system that reduces their exposure. You've got to look at all of that together. And I think that's the case that Bernie is going to be making.
All right, Senator Chris Murphy, thank you very much for being on the show this morning.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.